was Friday, July 15th, 2022, and this was just another ordinary evening in Jouberton's Extension 16. Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy, dressed in his usual designer clothes, leaned casually against his car, laughing and chatting with someone. But what Ndamoy didn't know was that death was already watching him. You see, Nguzo wasn't just any man roaming the streets of Jouberton. He was one of the most feared gangs in South Africa's northwest. He ruled through terror and he walked around like he was untouchable, but power has a way of blinding even the sharpest men. Nguzo saw himself as invincible, a god among mortals. And that, right there, was his biggest mistake, one he'd never get the chance to fix. That evening, in a split second, everything changed. His empire, built over years of violence and fear, came crumbling down right before his eyes. And the man who once called himself king became just another name on the long, bloody list of South Africa's fallen gangsters. This is the story of Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy, the rise, the fall, and the brutal end of a man who thought he was untouchable. Born in the outskirts of Klerksdorp, South Africa, Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy rose from humble beginnings to become the feared and revered kingpin of one of the most notorious gangs the area had ever seen, Al-Qaeda. Nguzo grew up in the streets of Jouberton, a township sitting quietly on the edge of Klerksdorp in South Africa. Life was hard. Poverty, crime, and violence were part of daily life. For most kids, the only future they saw was either jail or but Nguzo saw something else. He saw an opportunity. From a young age, he was sharp, smart, and always watching. He learned how people think, what makes them scared, and what makes them move. It didn't take long for him to understand. If he wanted to survive, he needed power. It all started small, as it often does. Nguzo began by running errands for older street thugs, collecting debts, intimidating rivals, and learning the unwritten rules of the township's underworld. But it wasn't long before he realized that following orders wasn't his style. Nguzo had bigger dreams. He wanted control. He wanted to be the one giving the orders. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had his own crew. He gathered boys from the same streets he grew up in, friends who knew hunger, fear, and struggle just like he did. These were kids who didn't have much, but with Nguzo, they saw a chance for something more: money, respect, and protection. That's how the Al-Qaeda gang was born. The name alone made people afraid. In Jouberton, when you heard someone mention Al-Qaeda, you knew trouble wasn't far behind. But Nguzo wasn't just about violence. He was smart. He knew brute force wasn't enough. You had to control everything. So, Al-Qaeda started running extortion rackets, selling and smuggling illegal. Local businesses paid protection money, rival gangs were swiftly dealt with, and anyone daring to oppose them found themselves either missing or. Nguzo was feared, but deep down, some people respected him too. He moved like a man who always knew what was coming. For years, nobody could touch him. The police, they were too scared, too poor, or sometimes even working with him. For a long time, Jouberton was his kingdom. He ruled it, and everyone knew it. But no matter how strong a man becomes, there's always a crack somewhere. And for Nguzo, that crack came from the one place he never expected, inside his own gang. By early 2022, things in Jouberton were already boiling. The Al-Qaeda gang, led by the feared Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy, had the township in a chokehold. Money was flowing, were everywhere, and loyalty became the only thing that kept you alive. But in a world like that, loyalty is weak and betrayal is only a matter of time. Right in the middle of this was Thabo Nsi, better known as Bra Thabo. For years, Thabo had been Nguzo's right-hand man. He ran jobs, collected money, and made sure people respected the gang. Many feared him just as much as they feared Nguzo, but something changed along the way. Rumors started spreading. People whispered in taverns that Thabo was no longer loyal. Some said he was secretly meeting rival gangs. Others claimed he was working with the police, giving them information about Al-Qaeda in exchange for protection. In a gang like Al-Qaeda, betrayal is not something you survive. If the rumors were true, Thabo was a man walking. Then came that night in March 2022, the night everything came crashing down. Thabo was out drinking with his friends at a local tavern in Jouberton. It was supposed to be a normal night, drinks, laughter, music, and that township vibe. But outside, the danger was already waiting. Eyewitnesses say Nguzo was there, watching. Some believe he had been told Thabo would be there that night. Others say Nguzo had been following him for days, just waiting for the perfect time to strike. As Thabo and his friends left the tavern, it happened. Words were exchanged. angry, bitter, and loud enough that people nearby stopped to watch. No one knows exactly what was said, but it was clear Nguzo wasn't going to let this slide. And then, without warning, Nguzo pulled out his Reports claim it was an R5 rifle, the kind used in serious gang hits. Before anyone could react, he opened fire. The sound of echoed through the night. People ran for cover. Thabo dropped right there in the street. By the time help arrived, it was too late. They rushed him to the hospital, but he was already gone, killed by someone he once called brother. The news spread like wildfire. Everyone knew what happened. Everyone knew who pulled the trigger. Nguzo had sent a clear message. Betrayal means Behind closed doors, the provincial anti-gang unit knew this was their chance. They had been watching Al-Qaeda for a long time, waiting for a reason to make a move. Now, with Thabo, they made Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy their #1 target, and they had concrete evidence to put him behind bars. And from that moment, the countdown to Nguzo's own downfall had begun. For weeks, undercover police officers moved through the streets, listening, watching, and gathering information. Locals were scared to talk. They spoke in whispers, knowing that one wrong word could get them. But little by little, the police started putting the pieces together. Everyone knew where Poul, Nguzo, and Ndamoy liked to hide, but catching him was a different story. He never stayed in one place for too long. He was always watching his back. What Nguzo didn't know was that the police weren't just after him for Thabo Nitsi. They were also building a case against him for his illegal gun, the that kept his gang in power. Then, on a cold evening in May 2022, the trap was finally set. The police had tracked Nguzo to a house in Jouberton's Extension 13. He thought he was safe there. He thought no one would dare come for him in his own territory. But this time, he was wrong. The anti-gang unit moved in quietly. No sirens, no warning shots. They surrounded the house, blocking every way out. Nguzo had spent years running from the law, but now he had nowhere left to run. When the officers kicked down the door, they found him inside. There was no fight, no shootout. Maybe even Nguzo knew that his time was up. In the corner of the room, police found a stash of ammunition and a loaded rifle magazine, clear proof of his crimes. As they put the handcuffs on him, the streets outside filled with whispers. Word spread fast. Nguzo had been caught. Some people were relieved, quietly celebrating behind closed doors. Others were nervous. They knew his arrest could shake up the gangs in Jouberton. The charges against him were serious. Illegal possession of and ammunition. As the police cars drove away with him, it felt like the end of an era. But in a world like this, nothing is ever that simple. Nguzo's lawyers quickly fought to get him out on bail. They argued that the police had no strong evidence, only scared witnesses who might not even testify. Shockingly, the court agreed. They let him out on bail, but with strict rules. He had to stay in Klerksdorp, report to the police station regularly, and avoid speaking to witnesses. Back on the streets, Nguzo was walking a fine line. Some thought his release meant he was still powerful, still protected, but others saw it as a weakness. They whispered in dark corners, planning their next move. Revenge was coming. Meanwhile, his trial dragged on. The state struggled. Witnesses went missing. Some were too scared to testify. Others simply refused. Without their statements, charge became harder to prove. But for Nguzo, the real danger wasn't in court. It was out in the streets, where old enemies were waiting. Then came that fateful day, July 15th, 2022. It was just another Friday evening in Jouberton's Extension 16. Nguzo, dressed in his usual designer clothes, leaned casually against his car, laughing and chatting with someone. But was already hunting him. Without warning, a white Toyota Quantum with no license plates screeched to a halt nearby. The sliding door flung open, and 3 masked men jumped out. Before anyone could react, the air was filled with the sound of automatic fire. Bullets tore through Nguzo's body, chest, head, everywhere. Witnesses say he didn't even get a chance to run. Within seconds, it was over. The gunman jumped back into the car and sped off, leaving Nguzo's lifeless body behind. By the time the police and ambulance arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. Poul Nguzo Ndamoy, the man who once ruled Jouberton's streets with fear and power, was News of his spread like wildfire. Some cheered, others cried, but everyone knew this was payback. Whether it was Thabo Nitsi's people, a rival gang, or someone from within his own circle, no one could say for sure. But in the end, it didn't matter. The king of Jouberton was gone. Nguzo's effectively the trial. Without the main suspect, the case of Thabo Nitsi collapsed. Nguzo's funeral was set for Sunday, July 24th, 2022, barely a week after his In typical gangster fashion, the funeral was meant to be more than just a farewell. It was a statement, a message to the township, the police, and rival gangs that Al-Qaeda was still standing. On the day of the funeral, hundreds gathered, friends, family, gang affiliates, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness what would likely be a historic day in Jouberton. The sight was surreal. Expensive German cars lined the streets. Some mourners arrived dressed in designer clothes, while others wore t-shirts printed with Nguzo's face. Rest in power Nguzo, printed in bold letters. With Nguzo gone, the question on everyone's mind was simple. What happens to Al-Qaeda? Nguzo had ruled the gang with an iron fist. His charisma, ruthlessness, and connections kept the gang united. But his sudden ripped that unity apart. Almost immediately, factions within the gang began to form. Lieutenants who once stood together now turned on each other, each claiming they were Nguzo's rightful successor. Some members pushed to continue Nguzo's legacy, keep the operations running, maintain the protection rackets, the extortion. But others, fearing the police heat and rival gangs, wanted out. They knew that without Nguzo, Al-Qaeda was vulnerable, and the streets could smell that vulnerability. Rival gangs like Boko Haram, another notorious group in the Northwest, began testing Al-Qaeda's territories. Robberies increased, shootings became more frequent, and innocent residents got caught in the crossfire. Jouberton transformed into a war zone overnight.